That's a $200,000 car, man. You want to tell me whose keys you're holding? Registration says out of state. You sure this is
I
yours?
already told you, it's mine.
You understand why that sounds a little unlikely?
Sounds like a problem you got, not me.
All right, go ahead and turn around for me. Put your hands behind your back.
Seriously?
Let's go. Turn around.
Marcus Williams had just left the Ferrari dealership where he was doing the 6-month maintenance on his bright red car, a Ferrari 488 Spider he had bought with money he earned building his own software company. It was 2 in the afternoon on a sunny Thursday, and Marcus decided to stop at a gas station to fill up before returning to the office. He was 28 years old, wearing a simple white t-shirt, jeans, and white sneakers. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth beyond the red sports car he drove. Marcus had founded his tech company at 23, working 16-hour days for years until an app he developed exploded in popularity. Now he was a multimillionaire, but still dressed like the kid who grew up in a small apartment with his single mother. The gas station was moderately busy, with a few cars at the pumps and people going in and out of the convenience store. Marcus parked at the pump, got out of the Ferrari, and inserted his credit card to start fueling. He was checking emails on his phone, responding to messages from the team about an important presentation next week, completely absorbed in his thoughts. The sound of fuel filling the tank was relaxing, almost meditative. Marcus barely noticed when a police car entered the station and parked a few meters away. He had learned from a young age that it was better not to draw attention when police officers were around, so he continued focused on his phone, waiting for the tank to fill. What Marcus didn't know was that the officer inside the patrol car, a man named Derek Hutchins with 12 years on the force, had seen the red Ferrari enter the station and immediately became suspicious. In Hutchins's mind, a young black man driving a $200,000 car didn't make sense. There had to be something wrong. Maybe it was stolen. Maybe it was bought with drug money. Any explanation seemed more plausible to Hutchins than the possibility that Marcus had simply earned the money legitimately. Hutchins watched Marcus for a few minutes through the patrol car windshield, making his own prejudiced assumptions, building a narrative in his head that had no basis in reality. Marcus finished fueling and was putting the tank cap back when Hutchins got out of the patrol car and walked toward him. The officer was in his early 40s, stocky build, and had that expression of unquestioned authority that some police officers wear as a mask. Marcus looked up and saw Hutchins approaching and immediately felt that familiar tension in his stomach. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was literally just fueling his own car. But he knew, from experience and from the stories of countless other black men, that this didn't necessarily matter. Hutchins stopped a few steps from the Ferrari, his eyes scanning the car first, then Marcus. The first thing Hutchins said wasn't a greeting or a polite question. It was an accusation disguised as a question. He asked Marcus where he had gotten that car, not whose car it was, not if Marcus needed help with something. Where he had gotten the car, as if the only possibility was that Marcus couldn't possibly own it legitimately. Marcus felt the familiar mixture of anger and exhaustion. How many times would he have to go through this? How many times would his property, his success, his very existence be questioned simply because he was black? But Marcus had learned to stay calm in these situations. He responded politely that the car was his, that he had just come from maintenance. Hutchins didn't accept that answer. He took a step closer, his hand resting casually near the holster, and said he needed to see the vehicle documentation and Marcus's ID. The tone wasn't a request. It was an order. Marcus took a deep breath and said the documentation was in the glove compartment and that he'd be happy to show it. He moved slowly toward the driver's door, announcing each movement because he knew any sudden gesture could be misinterpreted. But before Marcus could open the door, Hutchins said something that made Marcus's blood run cold. The officer stated with absolute confidence that he knew that car was stolen, that Marcus clearly couldn't afford to own a Ferrari, and that it would be better for him to just admit the truth now before things got worse. Marcus turned completely to face Hutchins, his face a mask of controlled disbelief. He asked directly what made Hutchins think the car was stolen. Was there an alert in the system? Any report? Any real evidence? Hutchins didn't answer these questions. Instead, he said it was obvious that young people like Marcus didn't drive Ferraris unless there was something illegal going on. The words came out of his mouth so naturally, it was clear Hutchins didn't even realize how flagrantly racist he was being. To him, it was just common sense, just police experience, just instinct. To Marcus, it was the same old prejudice, just coming from someone with a badge and a gun. Marcus kept his voice firm and said the car was registered in his name, that he had all the documentation, and that Hutchins was making assumptions based on absolutely nothing. He offered again to show the vehicle documentation, his driver's license, even receipts from the dealership if necessary. But Hutchins was now committed to his narrative. He ordered Marcus to step away from the vehicle and put his hands where they could be seen. Several gas station customers began to stop and watch the scene unfold. Some grabbed phones and started recording. A woman who was fueling at the next pump looked shocked, murmuring to her husband that this didn't seem right. Marcus took 2 steps back, away from the Ferrari, his hands raised to chest level, palms open and visible. He knew the script. He had seen this happen to friends, to family, had read countless stories of police encounters that ended badly. Every movement had to be deliberate, non-threatening, clear. Hutchins grabbed his radio and called for backup, saying he had a possible stolen vehicle and an uncooperative suspect. The way he said suspect made it sound like Marcus had committed some violent crime when all he was doing was trying to fuel his own car. Marcus felt the situation slipping out of his control, entering dangerous territory. That's when a man in his 50s, white, wearing a suit who was leaving the convenience store, stopped and shouted to Hutchins. The man said he was witnessing what was happening and that it looked a lot like racial profiling, that Marcus clearly hadn't done anything wrong. Hutchins turned and ordered the man to step away and not interfere in police matters. But the man wasn't intimidated. He said he was a lawyer and knew exactly what he was seeing, that unless Hutchins had real probable cause, he was violating Marcus's constitutional rights. This intervention seemed to make Hutchins even more defensive, more determined to prove he was right. Hutchins said loudly, for anyone listening, that a young black man in a Ferrari was automatically suspicious, that he had seen this 1,000 times before, that he was just doing his job. And it was at that moment that Hutchins sealed his own fate. He didn't realize that at least 5 people were recording on their phones. He didn't realize that his own words, said loud and clear, were a direct confession of racial bias. He was so confident in his authority, so certain of his assumptions, that he didn't even consider his words could be used against him. Marcus heard everything, memorizing every word, knowing this would be important later. A second patrol car arrived minutes later. 2 officers got out, a woman and a man, both looking confused about why they had been called. Hutchins began to explain the situation, saying he had a possible stolen vehicle. The female officer, whose badge said Santos, walked to the Ferrari and used her tablet to check the plate. She checked the system, then looked at Hutchins with a perplexed expression. Santos said the vehicle was registered to Marcus Alexander Williams. No alerts, no theft reports, absolutely clean. She asked Hutchins why he had called for backup for a car that clearly wasn't stolen. Hutchins was silent for a moment, realizing he had created a problem for himself, but still reluctant to admit the mistake. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but with an edge of steel. He said he wanted Hutchins's name and badge number because he was going to file a formal complaint, that he had been accused of stealing his own car without any evidence, that he had been racially profiled in front of witnesses, and that Hutchins's own words proved the entire stop was based on prejudice. Hutchins turned red, anger and embarrassment fighting on his face. He said Marcus should have simply cooperated from the beginning, that if he had just shown the documentation without questioning, none of this would have happened. It was the classic defense of someone who knew they were wrong, but refused to admit it. Officer Santos intervened before the situation escalated further. She turned to Marcus and apologized for the inconvenience, saying he was free to go. But Marcus wasn't ready to simply leave. He pointed to the several people still recording and said everything had been documented. That Hutchins had explicitly stated he stopped Marcus because a young black man in a Ferrari was automatically suspicious. That this wasn't police protocol, it was pure racial discrimination. The lawyer who had intervened earlier approached and handed his business card to Marcus, saying he would testify if necessary and that he had recorded most of the encounter. Hutchins tried one last time to regain some control of the situation. He said he had full authority to investigate suspicious activity, that he was protecting the community, that Marcus was overreacting to everything. But his words rang hollow, especially with Santos and the other officer looking at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to embarrassment. Santos told Hutchins in a low but firm voice that they needed to talk back at the station. The implication was clear. Hutchins had crossed a line and his own colleagues knew it. The other officer, whose name Marcus saw was Rodriguez, stood there embarrassed, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Marcus finally got into the Ferrari, his hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline and anger. He started the engine, which roared to life with that characteristic sound that normally made him smile. But today, there was no joy in it. Just the bitter realization that no matter how much he achieved, how much success he had, there would still be people who looked at him and saw only stereotypes. As he drove out of the station, Marcus saw Hutchins still standing there, watching him leave with an expression that mixed anger and what might have been a belated flash of awareness. But Marcus doubted Hutchins really understood the gravity of what he had done. Before leaving the gas station parking lot, Marcus stopped and used his phone to post a quick message on Twitter. He had over 50,000 followers, mostly people from the tech industry who followed his entrepreneurial journey. Marcus wrote that he had just been accused of stealing his own car by a police officer who explicitly said young black men in expensive cars were automatically suspicious, that he was tired, furious, and determined to hold those involved accountable. Within minutes, the post began receiving hundreds of replies, retweets, and messages of support. The story was beginning to spread. When Marcus arrived at the office 20 minutes later, his executive assistant immediately noticed something was wrong. She asked if he was okay, and Marcus briefly told her what had happened. She was outraged, immediately offering to call the company's corporate lawyer. But Marcus said he already had a plan. He entered his office, closed the door, and began making calls. First, to his personal lawyer. Second, to the local ACLU. Third, to an investigative reporter he knew from tech conferences. Marcus wasn't going to let this pass. He wasn't going to accept empty apologies or promises of additional training. Hutchins had shown his true character at that gas station, and Marcus was going to make sure there were real consequences. The videos started appearing online that same night. At least 4 different angles of the incident at the gas station, all showing essentially the same thing. Marcus standing calmly next to his Ferrari, Hutchins approaching aggressively, and most devastating, the clear audio of Hutchins saying a young black man in a Ferrari was automatically suspicious. There was no way to deny, twist, or reinterpret it. His own words condemned him. The most viewed video had been posted by a teenager who was in the car with her parents. She had captured almost 10 complete minutes, including the part where Officer Santos confirmed the car was registered to Marcus and the expression on Hutchins's face when he realized his mistake. The story exploded on social media overnight. Marcus's Twitter had been just the beginning. Now, influencers with millions of followers were sharing the videos, commenting on racial profiling, demanding justice. The hashtag Justice for Marcus started trending nationally. People shared their own stories of being stopped, questioned, or treated with suspicion simply for driving nice cars, wearing expensive clothes, or existing in spaces where others didn't expect to see them. Marcus's case touched a nerve because it was so blatant, so clearly documented, so impossible to deny. There was no gray area here, just an officer explicitly saying race was his criterion for suspicion. The police department issued a statement the next morning, trying to control the damage. They said Officer Hutchins had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, that they took all allegations of misconduct seriously, and that they were committed to fair and impartial policing. But the statement was met with skepticism and anger. People pointed out that Hutchins had 12 years on the force. How many other times had he done this and simply not been caught on video? How many other black drivers had he stopped based on nothing but prejudice? Investigative reporters began digging into Hutchins's records, looking for patterns in his stops and arrests. Marcus gave his first televised interview 3 days after the incident. He sat down with a respected news anchor and told his story with impressive calm. He described the moment he realized he was being profiled, the fear he felt even knowing he had done nothing wrong, the humiliation of having to prove he owned his own car. Marcus also talked about his success, not to brag, but to illustrate a point. He had built a $50 million company. He employed over 100 people. He paid taxes, contributed to charity, was an active member of his community. And yet, to Hutchins, none of that mattered. All Hutchins saw was the color of his skin. The interview ended with Marcus making an announcement. He was suing Derek Hutchins personally and the police department for civil rights violations, false arrest, and emotional suffering. His lawyer, Anthony Richardson, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state, was beside him in the interview. Richardson explained they had video evidence from multiple angles, witnesses willing to testify, and Hutchins's own words admitting the stop was based on race. Richardson said they hoped to establish a precedent that would make police officers personally accountable for racial profiling, not just the departments that frequently paid settlements with taxpayer money without real consequences for individual officers. The reaction was immediate and divided. Civil rights advocates applauded Marcus's decision to sue. They said it was time for police officers to face personal consequences for discrimination, that protections like qualified immunity had gone too far in protecting misconduct. But police unions and some conservative groups argued Marcus was overreacting, that officers needed protections to do their jobs without fear of frivolous lawsuits. But their arguments seemed weak in the face of videos that so clearly showed what had happened. Even some veteran police officers commented publicly that Hutchins's behavior was indefensible and gave a bad reputation to officers who truly served their communities with integrity. The police department's internal investigation took 6 weeks, and the results were devastating for Hutchins. Investigative reporters had obtained access to public records of his stops over the past 5 years through Freedom of Information requests. The data showed an undeniable pattern. Hutchins stopped black drivers at a rate 3 times higher than the department average. Of those stops, 68% didn't result in citations or arrests, suggesting there was no legitimate cause for most of them. There were also 5 previous formal complaints filed against Hutchins by citizens alleging discriminatory treatment, all filed away by the department without proper investigation. The department had ignored the warning signs for years. Anthony Richardson filed the lawsuit in federal court 9 weeks after the gas station incident. The complaint was meticulously detailed, including links to all videos, complete transcripts of what Hutchins said, witness statements, and statistical analysis of Hutchins's stop patterns. Richardson was seeking $1,200,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. More importantly, he was arguing that qualified immunity shouldn't apply because Hutchins had violated clearly established rights in such an obvious way that no reasonable officer would think his behavior was legal. It was a bold legal strategy that could set important precedent. The case attracted national attention. Civil rights organizations filed briefs in support of Marcus. Police reform groups used the case as a prime example in their campaigns for accountability. Law schools added the case to curricula as an example of clearly documented racial profiling. Marcus involuntarily became the face of a larger movement, appearing at conferences, giving lectures, sharing his story repeatedly. He said in interviews he never wanted to be an activist, he just wanted to drive his car in peace. But since Hutchins had forced this situation, Marcus was determined to transform it into something that could create real change. Hutchins hired lawyers through the police union, but his defense was built on quicksand. They tried to argue Hutchins had reasonable basis for suspicion, because luxury cars were often targets of theft. But Richardson easily destroyed that argument by pointing out Hutchins never checked if the Ferrari was on the stolen vehicle list before confronting Marcus, and that his own words made clear Marcus's race was the deciding factor. Hutchins's lawyers tried to suppress the videos as inadmissible, but the judge denied it, saying they were made in public space and were highly relevant. With every legal move, Hutchins's position got weaker. The pressure on Hutchins personally was immense. His identity had become public through the news. People recognized him in public, confronted him, filmed him. His house was vandalized twice with graffiti calling him racist. His wife filed for divorce, citing the stress and public shame. Hutchins had to move 3 times in 6 months, trying to find somewhere he wasn't recognized. Some argued this was justice. Others said it was mob revenge going too far. But Marcus never encouraged harassment or violence. He repeatedly said in interviews he wanted justice through the legal system, not vigilantism. 10 months after the incident, the police department's lawyers approached Richardson with a settlement proposal. They offered $700,000, Hutchins's termination, and reforms to department training. Marcus refused. He wasn't interested in letting Hutchins escape without personal accountability, and $700,000 didn't reflect the severity of the violation. Richardson counteroffered with $1,400,000, with at least half coming personally from Hutchins through his assets and future wage garnishments, permanent revocation of his police certification, and creation of an independent civilian oversight fund with real power to investigate discrimination complaints. After 2 weeks of tense negotiations, the department agreed to all terms. The settlement was announced at a press conference 12 months after that day at the gas station. Marcus stood next to Anthony Richardson on the federal courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras from all major news networks. Richardson detailed the settlement terms, emphasizing it was one of the first cases where a police officer would be personally financially liable for racial profiling. Hutchins would have to pay $600,000 from his own resources, which meant selling his home, liquidating his savings, and having his future wages garnished for years. The other $800,000 would come from the police department. Most importantly, Hutchins could never work in law enforcement again anywhere in the United States. Marcus spoke for almost 10 minutes, his voice firm and clear. He said he didn't do this for the money. He did it because he was tired of living in a country where his skin was seen as evidence of criminality, where his success was treated as impossible or suspicious, where he could build a multi-million-dollar company and still be treated like a thief at a gas station. Marcus thanked the witnesses who recorded the incident, especially those who didn't know him but chose to document the injustice anyway. He said without those videos, it probably would have been just his word against Hutchins's, and everyone knew how those situations usually ended. Derek Hutchins was formally fired from the police department the day after the settlement announcement. There was no ceremony, no farewell. He simply turned in his badge, his gun, and cleaned out his locker while supervised. Hutchins gave a single interview afterward with a small local news station where he tried to present himself as a victim. He claimed his life had been destroyed by a single error in judgment, that the punishment didn't fit the crime, that he had served 12 years with distinction. But his words rang hollow, especially when the interviewer asked directly if he understood why saying young black men in expensive cars were automatically suspicious was racist. Hutchins hesitated, tried to explain that's not what he meant, but it was clear he still didn't really understand or refused to admit it. Marcus used his portion of the settlement strategically. He established the Driving While Free Foundation, dedicated to providing free legal assistance to victims of racial profiling by police. The foundation also created an app that allowed people to document police stops easily, automatically upload videos to secure servers, and connect with lawyers if needed. In its first year, the foundation helped 43 people file complaints against officers for discriminatory treatment. Marcus also donated generously to police reform organizations and programs that helped young black people enter tech and entrepreneurship fields. The police department implemented the reforms required by the settlement. They created a civilian oversight panel with 9 community members who had real power to review complaints and recommend discipline. Every officer now went through 80 annual hours of implicit bias training, not the half-hour videos they used to watch. All traffic stops now required officers to clearly document probable cause before approaching a driver. And most importantly, the department now tracked demographic data from all stops and published it quarterly, allowing the community to see if there were patterns of discrimination. The changes weren't perfect, but they were real. Marcus's story resonated far beyond his individual case. In the 2 years following the settlement, 17 other lawsuits were filed in different states using Marcus's case as precedent. Police officers who had felt protected by qualified immunity now faced real personal accountability for racial profiling. Some departments began taking complaints more seriously, knowing that ignoring patterns of discrimination could result in expensive lawsuits. The case even reached legislative discussions about reforming or eliminating qualified immunity in cases of obvious civil rights violations. Marcus became a frequently cited voice in these debates, always bringing the conversation back to that moment at the gas station when he simply wanted to fuel his car. Derek Hutchins disappeared from public life after the disastrous interview. Rumors said he had moved out of state, was working in private security using a different name. He lost his home, his savings, his marriage, and his career. Some felt sorry for him, arguing the punishment was excessively severe. But Marcus, when asked about it, always responded the same way. Hutchins didn't lose those things because of an honest mistake. He lost them because he spent years operating with prejudice, ignoring people's rights based on race, and was finally caught in a way that couldn't be denied or swept under the rug. Consequences were part of living in a society of laws. Marcus continued driving his Ferrari, though now he always kept his phone ready to record if necessary. He never forgot that day at the gas station. The memories still made him angry sometimes, especially on quiet nights when he reflected on how many times similar situations happened without cameras, without witnesses, without justice. But he transformed that anger into action. The Driving While Free Foundation grew to have 12 full-time employees. The app had been downloaded over 200,000 times, and Marcus used his platform as a successful entrepreneur to speak consistently about racial injustice, not just in law enforcement, but in all aspects of society. The case, Marcus Williams versus Derek Hutchins in Police Department, became a landmark in civil rights law. It was studied in law schools, cited in legal briefs, referenced in political debates. But for Marcus, it was never really about establishing precedents or creating systemic change, though those things were important. It was about dignity. It was about being able to exist in the world without being constantly questioned, suspected, or treated as criminal. It was about one day maybe young black men being able to drive nice cars without fear of being profiled. And if his case helped move society even an inch closer to that reality, then it was worth every difficult moment, every painful interview, every time he had to relive that humiliation at the gas station. Because in the end, it wasn't just about Marcus Williams and Derek Hutchins. It was about creating a country where an officer's own words admitting racial profiling would result in real consequences, not empty apologies. And in that respect, Marcus had won.